The things we love have either always existed in our lives and we have no recollection of when we first noticed them, or we're introduced to them in a way that will always stick with us. For example, most people can't remember the first time they ever saw their parents, whereas meeting our own children for the first time will generally be something that sticks with you because you're either going through the agony of squeezing one out, or being forced to watch as your partner squeezes one out, which is equally as traumatic. Sorry, honey, I know it hurts, but look at it from my perspective. I'm the one stuck down here watching all the gooey bits. Popular entertainment is no different. I can't recall the first time I ever saw Scooby-Doo. My earliest memories of the cartoon are me running out of the room screaming during the creepy opening credits. The dawn of my love for the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, however, can be dated with pinpoint accuracy. During Christmas of 1983, my grandmother gave me a present which, to be honest, I wasn't that excited about at the time. It was a small wooden box containing 6 audio cassettes with the words "The Hobbit" burned into the top and sides. Remember, this was almost 20 years before Peter Jackson made Tolkien cool for everyone, and not just for people who played Dungeons & Dragons. As a child, it wasn't like I'd never heard of The Hobbit before. I had been vaguely aware of the Rankin-Bass cartoon, having once seen a storybook based on that version. And just look at that cover. Not only is it ugly as hell, but the book said something about hobbits living in Middle-earth, which to my mind, and based on that cover of Bilbo coming out of a hole, made me think that hobbits were something akin to human-mole hybrids or something. Pass. So the wooden box sat in my room for days until, bored, I popped the first cassette into my comically ugly gray 1980s boombox while playing with my Star Wars action figures. It didn't take long before I was sucked into the story, and my childhood, which had once been entirely consumed by the goings-on in a galaxy far, far away, began the inexorable transformation into teenage years spent within the comfortable high fantasy confines of elves, dwarves, dragons, magic rings, and hobbits. For Christmas the following year, my grandmother gave me a similar wooden box containing The Lord of the Rings, adapted by the same production house, The Mind's Eye. The Mind's Eye was a theater company from the 1970s that primarily produced dramatizations for NPR, National Public Radio. It's difficult for modern audiences to appreciate the idea of listening to literary works on radio, especially for those living in the United States. We tend to think of this as something families in the 1940s did while sitting around a giant RCA Victor waiting for Philo Farnsworth to get off his ass and invent television. Radio dramas still persist to this day, though they're certainly not that popular with American audiences. In 1979, Bernard Mays, the co-founder and first chairman of NPR, adapted The Lord of the Rings for broadcast in 24 episodes, running a little under 11 hours. The following year, he followed up with a 6-hour version of The Hobbit, mirroring Peter Jackson's decision to adapt the sequel before the original. Unlike the Jackson films, there is a distinct difference in quality between the two trilogies, and by that I mean The Lord of the Rings was a masterpiece of preparation and production value, while The Hobbit was, to put it nicely, a rushed CGI mess. The Mind's Eye Tolkien adaptations were produced a mere 1 year apart and kept most of the same actors and audio effects. Because of this, there will be no effort here to separate discussion between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. These are the actual original cassette copies my grandmother gave me back in the early 1980s. What immediately sets the Mind's Eye adaptations apart from other Tolkien media is their packaging. Both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were bound in a plain wooden box with burned lettering on the tops and sides. This packaging was also used later for the CD releases. The original list price for these cassettes were $30 for The Hobbit and $60 for The Lord of the Rings. That's about $80 and $160 in today's money. Thank you, Grandma! The internal packaging is just as plain. The Hobbit cassettes include the title, author, and the distributor's name and address, while the Lord of the Rings cassettes also feature a blurb and the names of some of the cast. The later CD packaging was equally as Spartan. Neither features any illustrations, which is actually kind of incredible considering Tolkien inspired an entire world of commercially eye-catching art. The stark packaging may be appropriate considering the limited technical aspects of the actual audio production itself. The Mind's Eye Theater group was comprised mostly of local West Coast performers, recording many of their parts separately and backed up by homemade or stock radio music and effects. Most of the acting is good, with the occasional miss, while the makeup of both British and American performances may be slightly off-putting for those accustomed to the uniformity of classical British accents employed in the Jackson films. It's also unfortunate that the pronunciation for names and places isn't always consistent either, as unlike Peter Jackson, the Mind's Eye obviously didn't have the funds to employ a Tolkien dialect expert to consult the cast. But for what it's worth, the Mind's Eye does a much better job than Rankin-Bass did.
Smug.
Sauron. Cirith Ungol.
Soren. Cirith Ungol.
Sauron!
Soren.
Cirith Ungol. Sauron. Minus Tirith. Minus Tirith. Sauron. Sauron.
Minus Tirith.
Cirith Ungol.
Minus Tirith. Soren. Cirith Ungol.
Sauron.
Soren.
Sauron. Sauron. Sauron.
Cirith Ungol.
Cirith Gorgor.
Sauron's.
Sauron.
Sauron.
Sauron. Sauron. Minus Tirith.
Incidentally, there was another radio adaptation of The Lord of the Rings produced roughly around the same time in England by the BBC. It had a much larger budget, with access to better radio effects and music, not to mention a complete cast of British actors including Ian Holm, who went on to play Bilbo in the Jackson films, and Bill Nighy, who went on to annoy Simon Pegg. Despite the BBC release often getting confused with what the Mind's Eye produced, the two adaptations are worlds apart, and oddly enough, despite being British in origin, the BBC version is less faithful to what Tolkien wrote than the one produced in America. In addition to adapting the books for broadcast, the London-born Bernard Mace also played Gandalf, as heard here.
I know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf. To think that I should have lived to be good-morninged by Belladonna Took's son, as if I was selling buttons at the door.
His gravelly and energetic performance is much harsher than what other actors have brought to the role of the Wandering Wizard, with both Ian McKellen and Michael Hordern from the BBC version taking a much calmer approach to the character.
You are the one who has the ring now.
I really don't want to talk about the Ralph Bakshi version. The nationality and gender of the actors who played the principal hobbits was just as varied, with Bilbo and Frodo played by men and Pippin, Merry, and Sam by women. Here is Bilbo, played by an American, Ray Reinhardt.
Exactly, that's what this council has to decide. Elves thrive on speech alone, and dwarves endure great weariness. But I'm only an old hobbit, and I miss my meal at noon. Think of some names now, or put it off till after dinner.
His voice is soothing and well suited to a middle-aged hobbit that wants no more than a life of leisure, enjoying the comforts of home like smoking a pipe after a large meal, far removed from uncomfortable adventuring. Frodo was also played by an American, James Arrington.
I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam. When things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are my heir. All that I had and might have had, I leave to you.
Not every actor nailed their performance. Out of the principal cast, I always found Arrington's Frodo the worst. He often sounds bored, like he was merely reading lines of dialogue without trying to breathe any life into them. It doesn't help that his voice occupies a lower register, while the majority of the rest of the Hobbit voices were played by higher-pitched women. It's likely Arrington was simply miscast. He did also voice Saruman, and while certainly no Christopher Lee, Arrington was a much better evil wizard than Hobbit.
A new power is rising. There is no hope left in elves or dying Numenor. We may join with that power. There is hope that way. It is victory at hand. We can bide our time, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose. Knowledge, rule, order.
Pippin was played by British-born Wanda McCadden, credited in this production as Mac McCadden.
Yes, it's all very dim and stuffy in here. It reminds me somehow of the old room back home at the great place of the Tooks, where the furniture has never been moved or changed for generations. Ooh. Look at all those weeping, trailing beards and whiskers of lichen. And most of the trees seem to be half covered with ragged, dry leaves that have never fallen. Untidy.
McCadden's voice is well suited to radio, and she went on to have a successful career as an audiobook narrator. Pat Franklyn, possibly from South Africa, played Merry.
I have a sword. May I lay the sword of Meriadoc of the Shire on your lap, Theoden? Receive my service, if you will.
While adequate for the role, Franklyn's casting as Merry felt wrong to me, mostly because she also played Bombur in The Hobbit, and since I listened to that version before The Lord of the Rings, it was difficult at times to reconcile the voice of Meriadoc Brandybuck, future Master of Buckland and Knight of Rohan, with that of a greedy dwarf who would eventually get so fat he would need the help of several younger dwarves just to get to the breakfast table. Sam was played by an American actress who only a few years later would go on to voice a significant 1980s cartoon icon. Listen to this snippet and see if you can guess who she was.
Me, sir? Me go and see elves and all? Hooray! Oh.
Yes, Sam was played by the voice of Smurfette herself, Lucille Bliss. Bliss's performance was energetic and provided dignity to Sam's rustic background, but sadly made Arrington's flat performance as Frodo all the more apparent. Her portrayal of Sam was also a much welcome change from the last time he appeared in mass media.
Me go and see the elves? Oh my! Oh, hooray!
I really don't want to talk about the Ralph Bakshi version. Bliss wasn't the only Mind's Eye performer who went on to later pop culture immortality. Listen to this snippet of King Theoden.
When dawn comes, I will bid men sound the ancient horn of this place, Helm's Horn, and I'll ride forth. Will you ride with me then, son of Arathorn? Maybe we'll cleave a road, or make such an end as will be worth a song, if any be left to sing of us hereafter.
That was Brooklyn-born Eric Bauersfeld, the voice of Mon Calamari leader and popular meme star Admiral Akbar from Return of the Jedi. Bauersfeld would reprise that role in The Force Awakens, his last credited performance before dying in 2016.
Taken like an old badger in a trap. It's a trap!
Rounding out the principal cast was Tom Luce as Aragorn.
The sword that was broken, new forged. You shall not be sheathed again until the last battle is fought.
And who also played Thorin Oakenshield.
Well, there was a most specially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Small. One day, he flew up into the air and came south. The first we heard of it was a noise like a hurricane coming from the north and the pine trees on the mountain creaking and cracking in the wind.
Luce's performance didn't vary much between the two roles, but both were well done, and the similarity between them shouldn't be held against the actor. After all, both characters were exiled kings determined to win back their birthrights, yet found themselves dependent upon the actions of peace-loving hobbits. And finally, Gail Chugg, whose double duty as both the narrator and the voice of Gollum stands out as possibly the best thing about the Mind's Eye production. As the narrator, Chugg breathed life into Tolkien's prose, at times sounding amused like a parent reading a bedtime story to their children.
To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took when he went out.
and other times he was somber, like a newsreader reporting about a national tragedy.
A dread fell on them even as they passed between the lines of ancient stones, and so came to the single stone which stood in their path like a finger of doom.
But it's his performance as Gollum where Chugg really shines. Long before Andy Serkis made gargling milk and orange juice the default sound of the treacherous Smeagol, Chugg was already delivering the goods.
We guessed, yes, we guessed, and we didn't want them to go, did we? No, precious, not the nice hobbits. Ashes and dust and thirst there, and pits, and orcs, thousands of orcs, says nice hobbits mustn't go to those places.
As a character, Gollum has always seemed to bring out good performances in the actors voicing him, whether it's the aforementioned Serkis or Brother Theodore's version in the Rankin-Bass cartoons. Well, almost all of them.
Hobbits always supply to use. Tired, thirsty Smeagol, he finds a secret way through the mountain. A tunnel with no orcs anywhere, and they say sneak. Sneak!
Hello, Smeagol. Where have you been?
Sneaking!
I really don't want to talk about the Ralph Bakshi version. The majority of the Mind's Eye production was entertaining and rose far above what its limited budget and resources should have produced, though it did drop the ball a few times. As previously mentioned, some of the characters were poorly acted, but possibly the worst is how the elves were portrayed. It's important to place the Mind's Eye adaptations in context to when they were produced. Despite how Tolkien envisioned them back in the mid-20th century as a dignified high fantasy elder race, most of the modern media at the time still considered elves impish and fairy-like, a perception that was sadly reflected in this particular production. For example, take Elrond, played by Carl Hague.
They must have come from a dragon's horde or goblin plunder, and the trolls had plundered the plunderers.
In contrast, Galadriel, played by the same actress who voiced Pippin, sounded like this.
Well, Master Samwise, I hear and see that you have used my gift well. The Shire shall now be more blessed and beloved than ever.
The vocal difference between the two is jarring, with Elrond sounding more like a cousin of Gollum rather than Galadriel. Legolas was gracefully voiced by John Vickery.
Not of all that go on two legs. There I think you're wrong. It's orcs that they hate. For they don't belong here, and know little of elves and men. Far away are the valleys where they sprang. From the deep dales of Fangorn, Gimli, that's whence they come, I guess.
Meanwhile, the same actress who played Merry also played King Thranduil, the father of Legolas.
Bilbo Baggins, you are more worthy to wear the armour of elf princes than many that have looked more comely in it. But I wonder if Thorin Oakenshield will see it so. I advise you to remain with us.
In fact, none of the Mirkwood Forest elves escaped this treatment.
Where's old Galleon the butler? I didn't see him at the tables tonight. He ought to be here now to show us what's to be done.
I'll be angry if the old slow coach is late. I'm no wish to waste time down here while the song is up.
There's the old villain with his head on a jug.
Oh well, I guess it's slightly better than being smurfed with progeria. Now to delve into one of the more controversial aspects of Tolkien fandom. This guy. Unlike most other adaptations, Tom Bombadil was included in the Mind's Eye production, played by Bernard Mays. While Mays did an excellent job as Gandalf, his Bombadil was cringe-inducing, though whether that's the fault of the actor or the source material is open for discussion.
Now, my little fellows, where be you going to, puffing like a bellows? I'm Tom Bombadil. Tell me, what's your trouble? Tom's in a hurry now, don't you crush my lily.
In May's defense, Tom Bombadil himself is a cringe-inducing character, and it's doubtful that even Sir Laurence Olivier could have delivered any gravitas to Hey doll, merry doll, ring-a-dong dillo, ring-a-dong, hop-along, fa-la-la the willow. Poor voice direction aside, unlike the BBC with their huge audio effects library and access to a wide range of studio equipment, the sound effects produced by the Mind's Eye were primitive and often seemed to be nothing more than someone banging a stick against the floor. They also reused a lot of the same background sound, particularly crowd noises, which is very obvious on repeated listening. Despite these flaws, I feel the Mind's Eye still produced an excellent adaptation, mainly due to Mays having kept as much of Tolkien's original writing as possible in his script, either by having the narrator read it verbatim or by expanding the dialogue of certain characters, which can be very tricky if poorly done. For example, here's how Rankin-Bass conveyed Sam's reaction to the ring's temptation.
I could claim you, ring. I would be Samwise the Strong.
What brought me back? Plain hobbit sense. I know in my heart I'm not enough to bear such a burden. One small garden of a free gardener is all my need and due.
Versus how quickly Sam reflects on things in The Mind's Eye.
Maybe I should use it. Use it? Me? Yes. No. I could become Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, armies flocking to my call. And this place? I'd turn this place into a garden of flowers and trees and fruit. Yes, just put the ring on and claim it for my own. But Frodo, Mr. Frodo. And I really need only one small garden, not a whole realm of gardens.
It can be argued that Rankin-Bass successfully emphasized the incredible corrupting power of the ring, but I prefer how The Mind's Eye showed Sam's quick, no-nonsense appraisal of his own limitations in wielding such a terrible weapon. One of my favorite scenes in The Lord of the Rings was the confrontation between Gandalf and the Witch King at the Broken Gate of Minas Tirith. The BBC treated it like this.
Old fool, old fool, this is my hour. Do you not know death when you see it? Die now and curse in vain.
The horns of the Rohirrim! Theoden is come at last!
While in the Mind's Eye version...
Old fool, this is my hour. Don't you know death when you see it? Die now and curse in vain. See my sword in flames. Gandalf did not move. And in that very moment, away behind in some courtyard of the city, a cock crowed. Shrill and clear he crowed, recking nothing of wizardry or war, welcoming only the morning that in the sky far above the shadows of death was coming with the dawn. And as if in answer came from far away another note, horns! Great horns of the north, wildly blowing. Rohan had come at last. The Lord of the Nazgul paused, turned, and was gone.
The BBC rushed the scene and didn't stop to appreciate the gravity of the situation, whereas The Mind's Eye took the time to portray it for what it was. Gandalf, tired and almost broken, hopelessly confronting a much stronger adversary at the moment of the latter's final triumph, only to have that victory stolen by the unexpected arrival of reinforcements. Tolkien wrote a pivotal emotional scene, and the BBC glossed right over it. Mays deserves much credit for understanding what worked so well in Tolkien's writing. These days it's easy to find the Mind's Eye adaptations online, as unauthorized uploads are all over YouTube. Legitimate copies are a bit harder to get hold of. Obviously the audio cassette versions are long out of print, and it's a dead media regardless. The CD copies are more easily obtainable, with a few sellers still offering The Lord of the Rings still in its original shrink wrap, while gently used copies of both can be found on eBay. What's unfortunate is neither release is 100% complete. While both contain most of the same material, there are bits and pieces that either exist solely in the cassette version or CD version exclusively. It's also unfortunate that the transfer to CD wasn't engineered very well, as there are scattered sections throughout where the original master tape was likely stretched or damaged, making the audio sound speeded up or slightly distorted. Thinking back, I owe an insurmountable debt of gratitude to my grandmother for introducing me to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. While it's always possible I may have stumbled upon The Lord of the Rings in my school library, I've never been one to randomly pick up a book or movie unless I was already a fan of the genre. Without my appreciation for Tolkien at such a young age, I may have gone 3 decades before Frodo, Sam, and Bilbo entered my life via Peter Jackson. While I'll never recapture the original joy of discovering the charms of Middle-earth, listening to the Mind's Eye production can still evoke a comfortable wave of nostalgia as I'm once again 11 years old, playing with my Star Wars action figures while the gentle words, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," begin to play in the background. Thinking back, it was pretty stupid of me to discount my grandmother's gift, since she also introduced me to my favorite author of all time, Douglas Adams, in the exact same way.
But behold, as the flagship standard broke the wind,